You think that old man's got what it takes? You're kidding, right? Ethan Hayes, the young recruit commander, sneered, his voice filled with sarcasm. The rest of the group laughed, their eyes flicking to the elderly man standing off to the side of the shooting range. John Dusty the Miller, 75 years old, stood there in worn khaki pants and an old jacket, looking out of place among the high-tech gear and younger recruits. His weathered face was calm, unbothered by the ridicule. His pale blue eyes locked on the target ahead, as if he were already inside the wind, the trajectory, the distance, all the details that these young men had yet to grasp. "He's just a relic," muttered Jack Bowman, a fresh recruit who was still learning the ropes, though his ego was already inflated. "What's he going to do? Teach us how to shoot with his walker?" The group chuckled again, but their laughter hung in the air, sharp and unsettling. The old man said nothing, his lips pressing together in a thin line. The only sound was the hum of the wind and the distant calls of instructors shouting commands to the others. "All right, Dusty, show us what you got," Ethan said, waving dismissively at the range. The challenge was clear, and the others leaned in, curious to see the veteran fail. Dusty slowly walked to the firing line, his steps deliberate, measured. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the rifle, but there was no panic in his movements. He didn't rush, didn't make a show. His fingers brushed against the cold steel of the weapon, feeling its weight as if it had been a part of him for decades. He took a slow breath, the only hint of life in his weathered face. "Dusty, you sure you still got it?" "That thing looks ancient," said Lucas King, barely hiding the grin on his face. Without a word, Dusty aimed his rifle at the target downrange. His posture was straight, unshaken by the mockery. He adjusted the scope, his fingers dancing across the knobs as if performing a quiet ritual, one that had been etched into his muscle memory years ago. Ethan and the others snickered, waiting for the inevitable miss. They were sure the old man couldn't possibly hit his mark. Dusty's finger hovered over the trigger, his gaze unwavering. The group watched. With bated breath, some holding back laughter, others waiting for a moment of embarrassment. Then, without warning, Dusty squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, cutting through the silence like a clap of thunder. The bullet slammed into the center of the target, dead on. A perfect shot. The sudden stillness that followed was like a punch in the gut. The recruits, once smug and confident, now stood frozen, staring in disbelief at the target. Ethan's mouth hung open, his arrogance quickly fading into something far less sure. "No way," Jack whispered, his eyes wide as he scanned Dusty, who was still standing calmly by the rifle. His hands were steady now, the tremble gone as if the shot had somehow grounded him. The recruits exchanged looks, none of them knowing what to say. The air around them seemed to shift. Dusty didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He simply lowered the rifle and walked off the range, leaving behind a group of young men who had underestimated him at every turn. The sound of his boots on the gravel was the only noise as the recruits finally snapped out of their daze. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of control, but the respect was already there, silently filling the air. They had been wrong about him. And for the first time, they realized just how wrong they were. The wind picked up again, whipping across the range as the sound of Dusty's shot still lingered in the air. Ethan Hayes stood frozen, his gaze locked on the target where the bullet had struck dead center. It was a perfect shot, flawless. He blinked a few times, trying to process what he had just witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. The old man couldn't possibly be that good. His confidence cracked. Jack Bowman, the cocky recruit who had been leading the ridicule, stood with his mouth hanging open. He couldn't fathom it. Lucas King, who had been one of the loudest voices in mocking the veteran, was now visibly nervous. The rest of the group stood in silence, unsure of what to do or say. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind rustling through the dry grass, the distant hum of a plane overhead, and the soft scrape of Dusty's boots on the gravel as he walked away from the line. He didn't look back, didn't pause, just kept walking like the moment had meant nothing. It was them who were shaken. Ethan watched Dusty with a mixture of respect and disbelief. His mind was still processing, still trying to justify what had happened. The old man had hit the mark, no questions asked. And the most unsettling part? He hadn't even seemed to try. No showmanship. No boasting. Just pure, unshakable skill. Ethan had been wrong. All of them had been wrong. He'd treated Dusty like an old relic, someone who had no place in this modern, high-tech world. They all had. But now, he was starting to wonder if the old veteran was something far more than just an outdated memory. The realization hit him slowly, like a weight settling on his chest. He glanced back at the recruits, who were still standing motionless, each of them processing the same truth. "We were idiots," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. He knew. The old man had proven them all wrong in one simple shot. Ethan turned his gaze back to the range, his mind working to understand what it was that made Dusty so different. What had he missed? What had he failed to see? The answer came to him then, not in the form of a revelation, but in the quiet stillness that Dusty had carried with him. The veteran didn't need to impress anyone. He didn't need to prove anything. His reputation, earned over decades of experience, spoke for itself. And now, standing here among the recruits, Ethan finally understood what true skill and wisdom looked like. It wasn't in the flashy gear or the newest technology. It was in the quiet, the calm, the steady hand that had seen more battles than they could ever imagine. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders loosening, as the sense of respect settled in. Dusty had taught him more in that one moment than he could have learned in any training session. He was no longer just an old man. He was a legend. And he had earned that title long before any of them had shown up. With a deep breath, Ethan squared his shoulders. He didn't know how to approach Dusty yet, but one thing was certain, he would be the first to extend an apology. Not just for the shot. For the way they had all treated him. It was time to show respect. To give the veteran the honor he deserved. The moment Dusty finished his walk, the atmosphere around the range began to shift. The recruits, still standing in a tight cluster, exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan Hayes, usually the first to take charge, remained quiet, his mind replaying the shot over and over again. He couldn't get it out of his head. The way Dusty had stood there, the precision in his aim, the calmness in his demeanor, it was all so effortless. The old man had done what none of them expected, and now the weight of it all was settling in on Ethan's shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. He was supposed to be the leader here, the one everyone looked to for guidance. But Dusty had just shown them all how little that truly meant. "You know," Jack Bowman said, his voice low and almost hesitant, "I thought he was just some old guy with a story. But damn, that shot was something else." Ethan nodded, still staring at the target. He couldn't help but feel a sense of shame. It wasn't just about the shot. It was about how they had treated Dusty before it. How easily they had dismissed him. "Yeah," Lucas King added, his tone quieter now. "He didn't even flinch. Didn't even seem to care that we were all watching him." Ethan finally turned to face them, the realization hitting him full force. The disrespect they had shown Dusty wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a blind arrogance. They had assumed they knew everything, about the world, about each other, about the military. But Dusty had shattered that illusion in an instant. The truth was, none of them had earned the right to look down on him. He was a man who had lived a life they could only imagine, a life filled with experiences that shaped him into something far greater than they could ever be at their age. Ethan walked towards the shooting line, his boots crunching against the gravel, his mind still racing. He didn't know what to say, but he knew he had to do something. The old man deserved that much, at least. He glanced over at Dusty, who was now sitting on a bench, his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. He looked so calm, so collected. Ethan wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to him. He needed to understand what made Dusty so different. With a deep breath, Ethan approached him. "Dusty," he started, his voice uncertain. I owe you an apology. For how we treated you earlier." Dusty didn't look up immediately. He just sat there for a moment, letting the words hang in the air between them. Ethan waited, his heart beating faster. Finally, Dusty's voice came, slow and steady, like a stream that had been running for years. "You don't owe me anything, son," he said, his words carrying more weight than they had any right to. "I've seen a lot of things in my day, and I've learned that respect isn't something you can demand. It's earned." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, something he hadn't expected. He nodded, taking a seat next to Dusty. They sat there in silence for a while, watching the recruit slowly begin to pick up their gear and move to their next task. It wasn't the loud, brash apology Ethan had imagined in his head. It was quieter, more real. "I'm sorry," Ethan said again, this time with more sincerity. "You've earned my respect." Dusty finally looked at him, his pale blue eyes meeting Ethan's. "You'll figure it out, son," he said with a small smile. "Just remember, it's not about the shot. It's about who you are when nobody's watching." Ethan nodded, a deep sense of understanding washing over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was learning something that mattered. It wasn't just about being the best or proving something to others. It was about knowing who you were and staying true to it, no matter how old you got. The day went on, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. And as he watched Dusty stand up, his movement slow but deliberate, he knew that the old man's lesson would stay with him long after they left the range. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself constantly glancing over at Dusty. The old veteran's presence had become a quiet anchor in the midst of the chaos of the training camp. Dusty, however, didn't seem to be paying any attention to the rest of the recruits. He had his own rhythm, his own pace, and he carried it with him everywhere he went. Ethan couldn't help but admire how effortless it all seemed for him. At one point, as they all gathered for a break under the shade of the barracks, Ethan found himself sitting next to Dusty. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the dirt. The recruits had started to loosen up a bit, but there was still a clear distance between them and the veteran. The respect they had for him was silent, but it was there, thick in the air. Ethan, feeling the weight of the conversation they had earlier, finally spoke. "You never talked about the past much, Dusty," Ethan said, his voice tentative. Dusty glanced at him, his blue eyes cool but not unkind. "There's not much to say, son," he replied, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The past has a way of sitting with you, whether you talk about it or not. I don't need to fill the air with stories. What's important is what you do now." Ethan paused, considering the weight of Dusty's words. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but something in Dusty's tone told him it wasn't the time. The old man had lived through things that Ethan couldn't begin to understand, and yet, there was a calmness about him that made Ethan feel small in comparison. "I guess I'm still trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do," Ethan said quietly, his thoughts tumbling out before he could stop them. "I mean, what's the point of all of this? The drills, the training, the structure, none of it feels like it matters, you know." Dusty turned to him fully then, his gaze steady and knowing. "It matters more than you think," he said slowly. "The training, the drills, they're not just about learning how to shoot or run faster. They're about learning who you are under pressure. Who you are when things get tough, when everything falls apart. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, but the words felt heavy. He wanted to believe them, but he wasn't sure yet. He hadn't faced the kind of pressure Dusty had. He didn't know what it felt like to have everything at risk. "So, how do I know if I'm ready for that?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Dusty smiled faintly, his expression softening. "You don't know until you're there, son. And when you get there, you'll know. But you've got to stop worrying about it. Just keep doing the work, keep showing up. The rest will come when it's time." There was something in Dusty's words, a calm certainty that Ethan found both reassuring and frustrating. It was clear that the old man had long ago accepted that life didn't always go as planned, that the best you could do was to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. Ethan thought about that as they finished their break and headed back to the range. The recruits were still shooting, still training, but now there was a new energy in the air. Ethan didn't know if he was quite ready to embrace what Dusty had said, but he knew one thing: he would keep trying. One step at a time, just like Dusty. And that was enough for now. The following days at the training camp felt different for Ethan. He couldn't shake the feeling of Dusty's presence. It was as though the old man had become a silent guide, quietly watching as Ethan and the others went through their routines. Ethan started to pay more attention to the little things: how Dusty moved, how he spoke, how he interacted with the world. It was subtle, but there was a strength in it. A quiet power that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. One morning, as the recruits gathered for a run, Ethan noticed Dusty standing off to the side, watching them. The group was getting ready, stretching and chatting, but Ethan could see that Dusty wasn't just watching them. He was studying them. There was something in his gaze, something sharp that cut through the noise of the camp. "You think you're ready for this?" Dusty's voice cut through Ethan's thoughts. Ethan turned to find the old man standing beside him, his arms crossed, his posture relaxed but commanding. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, a little caught off guard by the question. Dusty smiled slightly. "This whole thing. The running, the drills, the pressure. It's all about preparation. But the real test comes when it's not about the drill anymore. When it's about what you're made of." Ethan frowned, unsure how to respond. He'd always thought that the toughest part of the job was getting through the training. But Dusty's words made him realize there was more to it than that. You're gonna have days where the weight of it all feels too heavy. Days when you feel like you can't go on. That's when you'll find out who you really are. Not in the easy moments, but in the ones where you want to quit. Ethan felt the weight of the words settle in. He had always been able to push through the tough times. But what Dusty was saying, it wasn't just about strength. It was about endurance, about pushing past your own doubts. Ethan turned back to the group, noticing that the other recruits were starting to get restless, waiting for the signal to start. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "How do you know all this?" Dusty's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Because I've been where you are. And I've had to learn the hard way. You will too." With that, Dusty turned and began walking away, his steps slow but steady. Ethan watched him go, the words echoing in his mind. The run began, and as he jogged alongside the others, Ethan found himself thinking about the way Dusty had lived his life, how he had endured far more than anyone could understand, yet carried it all with grace. The rest of the run passed in a blur. Ethan's thoughts were consumed by Dusty's words, by the realization that this was just the beginning. The training, the drills, they were all just preparation for something bigger. For something that would demand more than just physical strength. It would demand mental fortitude and the willingness to keep moving even when everything inside told him to stop. As the run came to an end, Ethan found himself at the front of the group, his legs tired but his mind clearer than it had been in days. He realized that he wasn't just running for the finish line anymore. He was running for himself, for the man he wanted to become. And in that moment, he understood what Dusty had meant. It wasn't just about what you could do in the moment. It was about who you became when you had nothing left to give. The days that followed felt like a quiet shift for Ethan. He couldn't stop thinking about Dusty's words. Every morning, as the recruits gathered for their drills, Ethan found himself watching Dusty from the corner of his eye. The old man never pushed himself into the spotlight, never sought attention, yet there was a steady respect around him, an unspoken acknowledgement of the weight he carried. Ethan had started to understand something deeper, something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just about the drills or the skills. It was about the kind of man you became in the quiet moments. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling physical training session, Ethan found himself sitting alone near the edge of the camp. The others had gone to eat, but he wasn't hungry. His mind was occupied with the same thoughts that had been swirling in his head for days. Dusty appeared from the distance, walking slowly, as always, but with purpose. He stopped when he saw Ethan sitting there, his eyes meeting the younger man's without judgment, just calm curiosity. "You doing okay, son?" Dusty asked, his voice low and steady. Ethan hesitated for a moment. He hadn't realized how much he needed to talk to someone until now. I think so, he said slowly, looking out over the camp. But I'm starting to wonder if I'm even cut out for this. I mean, the drills are fine, but it's more than that. I feel like I'm missing something. Dusty nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's not about being cut out for it. It's about being willing to put in the work, even when you feel like you're not getting anywhere. That's the difference. Ethan looked at Dusty, searching his face for answers. But how do you know when you're ready? When it's your turn to step up? Dusty smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made everything seem simple. It was the kind of smile that carried years of understanding, of knowing exactly what it felt like to be where Ethan was now. You don't know until you're there, Dusty said. And even then, you don't know if you're truly ready. You just do it, because it's what needs to be done. Ethan sat back, trying to process the simplicity of the answer. It wasn't the reassurance he had expected. It wasn't a clear path. It was more of a challenge than anything else. Dusty had said it himself, you don't know if you're ready until you're in the middle of it. That realization hit Ethan harder than he expected. He wasn't going to find the answers by sitting back or by waiting for a perfect moment. He had to be willing to step forward, even when he felt uncertain. It's not easy, is it? Ethan muttered. Dusty chuckled, a soft, knowing laugh. No. It never is. But it's worth it. You'll see. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the camp carried on around them, voices, the clatter of equipment, the distant hum of helicopters, but in that small corner of the world, there was a rare moment of peace. Ethan's mind was still racing, but now it was different. There was no magic solution, no perfect answer. There was only the next step. And as he sat there with Dusty, he realized that maybe that was all he really needed to know. The next step. It was enough for now. With a deep breath, Ethan stood up. Dusty followed his lead, and together, they walked back toward the camp. Ethan wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might just be ready for whatever came next. The weeks seemed to blur together after that conversation with Dusty. The routine of training, the long hours spent running, lifting, and drilling, became less of a grind and more of a path that, somehow, felt less uncertain. Ethan found himself stepping into the daily challenges with a new mindset, one that wasn't so focused on perfection or hitting every mark. It was about showing up. And as he showed up, he noticed the difference. The other recruits had started to notice it too. They watched him more closely, perhaps sensing the shift. It wasn't just the physical stamina that had improved, it was the quiet resolve that Dusty had shown him. The ability to stand still when everything around you was moving at 1,000 miles per hour. One afternoon, after a long training session, Ethan was sitting alone in the break area, his mind wandering again. He had been trying to digest the lessons Dusty had shared, to apply them to his own life, and while he didn't have all the answers, he felt more grounded than he had before. Dusty approached him once more, as if drawn by the same quiet energy that had brought him to Ethan's side earlier. "How's it feel?" Dusty asked, his voice steady as usual. Ethan looked up, surprised at how natural it felt to have this conversation with the old man. "Better, I think," Ethan replied. "I've stopped trying to force everything. It's just about doing the work." Dusty nodded, his eyes softening. "That's the hardest part, son. Most people spend their lives chasing something they can't even define. The trick is not to chase. Just keep walking the path, and the rest will take care of itself." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. "But how do you know when you're on the right path?" Dusty smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You don't. Not really. You just have to trust that the steps you're taking are the right ones. No one knows where they're going, Ethan. Not really. But if you keep putting one foot in front of the other, you'll find your way." The simplicity of it hit Ethan like a wave. He had been caught up in the idea that there was a perfect path, a clear route to success and fulfillment. But Dusty was right. No one had all the answers, and trying to force an answer before its time was never going to work. So, you just keep going? Ethan asked, the question lingering in the air. Dusty chuckled softly. That's the idea. Keep going. Even when it's hard. Even when you don't know if you're doing the right thing. Just keep moving forward. It was the same lesson Dusty had been teaching him all along, only now it made more sense. Ethan wasn't trying to be perfect anymore. He was just trying to be better, one step at a time. And that was enough. As the conversation ended, Dusty gave him one last look before walking off to rejoin the other veterans who had gathered to talk. Ethan watched him leave, a sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was racing against time. He felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And that was more than enough. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Ethan felt like he was getting closer to something, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The drills continued, the physical training relentless, but he no longer felt the same weight on his shoulders. He didn't feel as if he had to prove anything to anyone anymore, not even to himself. The mindset that Dusty had shown him, that quiet resolve, had begun to take root deep inside him. There were still days when doubts crept in, when the exhaustion made him question everything, but now he knew what to do when that happened. He just had to keep moving. It was the small, seemingly insignificant moments that stood out now. One afternoon, as Ethan was finishing up a particularly tough set of drills, he found himself standing alone in the quiet of the training yard. The others had already gone to their meals, their laughter and chatter fading into the distance. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, looking out at the empty space before him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and for the first time in a while, he felt at peace. He wasn't alone, Dusty was there, standing at the edge of the yard, watching him quietly. Ethan had gotten used to the old man's presence, but today, it felt different. There was no need for words, Ethan knew what Dusty was thinking. It was as if the old man had always been there, not just physically but in every lesson, every piece of advice he had shared. Ethan took a deep breath and started walking toward him. "You're doing good," Dusty said, his voice low but clear. Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. There were still moments when the weight of the future felt overwhelming, when he wondered if he was ready for what was to come. "I don't know if I'm really cut out for this," Ethan admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I mean, some days it feels like I'm just going through the motions." Dusty looked at him, his expression unchanged. "Some days, that's all you can do. Just keep going. You don't have to have it all figured out today, tomorrow, or next month. You just have to keep showing up. That's the only thing that matters." Ethan's eyes flickered with understanding. He had been looking for a moment of clarity, a sign that everything would fall into place. But Dusty was right. There was no single moment when it would all make sense. It was the small decisions, the small moments of effort, that would build the foundation for whatever came next. "Thanks," Ethan said quietly, looking out at the yard once more. Dusty nodded and turned to walk away. "No need to thank me. Just remember, it's not about getting it right every time. It's about getting up every time you fall." With that, Dusty disappeared into the distance, leaving Ethan standing alone in the fading light. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he didn't need to. All he had to do was keep moving forward, step by step. The path would unfold as it was meant to. And that was enough. The weeks began to blur, and with each passing day, Ethan found himself becoming more and more familiar with the rhythm of the camp. The routines, the drills, the endless repetitions, they had all become second nature. But something had shifted in him. The pressure that had once felt like a weight was now something he could carry without breaking. Dusty's lessons, those quiet moments of guidance, had stayed with him, and with every challenge, Ethan felt himself standing a little taller. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about showing up, doing the work, and trusting that the rest would follow. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling series of physical endurance tests, Ethan found himself in a rare moment of solitude, sitting at the edge of the camp. His body ached, his muscles screaming from the intensity of the exercises, but his mind was calm. The doubt that had once clouded his thoughts had faded into something more manageable, something that no longer ruled him. He had learned how to push through it, how to keep going even when it felt like he couldn't. As he sat there, reflecting on the changes in himself, he saw Dusty in the distance, walking slowly toward him. The old man's presence had become a constant source of strength for Ethan, and today was no different. "How's it going, son?" Dusty asked, his voice as steady and calm as ever. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting Dusty's with a quiet sense of respect. "Better than I expected," he replied. "I think I'm finally starting to get it." Dusty's eyes softened, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It takes time," he said. "But you're getting there. You're doing the work, and that's all you can do." Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had come so far since the first day he stepped onto the camp. The doubt, the uncertainty, the fear of failure, it had all been replaced with something else. It wasn't confidence, not exactly. But it was trust. Trust in the process. Trust in himself. "I don't know if I'm ready for what's next," Ethan admitted, his voice quiet. "But I know I'm ready to keep going." Dusty placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "That's the important part. You're not going to know everything. You're not going to have all the answers. But you're willing to learn. That's what makes you ready." Ethan sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Dusty's words sinking in. He had spent so much time worrying about the future, about being prepared, about doing things perfectly. But now, he realized, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the willingness to show up, to keep moving forward, even when the path was unclear. As Dusty turned to walk away, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't have to have it all figured out. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep going, one step at a time. And for the first time, that was enough. The next day, as Ethan stood at the edge of the training yard, watching the recruits prepare for their next set of drills, he didn't feel the same sense of pressure that had once consumed him. He was ready, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to trust the process, to trust himself, and to trust that, with each step, he was becoming the man he was meant to be.